the negative team?
All set, thank you.
Let's get started. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." Now, clearly he didn't say that. In fact, Abraham Lincoln wasn't alive when the internet was invented. But the meaning behind the statement still stands true. We should examine the facts before we really make a decision. We should look deeper before really making a decision again. So in this speech, I'd like to talk about the facts. And I'd like to bring up 4 points spelling out the acronym FACT. F for a failed economy, A for a Russian presence, C for continued leverage, and T for terrorism thwarted. Now, first, before I get to that, I was asked to fulfill 2 burdens. And one was that how are the United States interests not being upheld? And so I'd like to tell you what the United States interests are, and I'd like to tell you what the harms in the current system are. The first harm is that human rights violations are being violated, or human rights are being violated. The second is Russian presence. The third is an unjustified sanction. The fourth is a failed economy, and the fifth is terrorism. Now, what are the United States' interests for Sudan? Well, there are 3. Human rights violations, countering terrorism, and stopping Russian influence. I believe that we can accomplish the 3 United States interests by passing the affirmative policy. I'd like to show that in today's speech. First, let's talk about a failed economy. What's the problem with the failed economy? Well, having a failed economy causes harm to tens of thousands of individuals. We showed this in our 1AC and it's been unrefuted to this point in today's debate round. And then underneath this, we can see that Sudan needs debt relief. And they said, Ahmed added that if the designation were lifted, his country would ask the International Monetary Fund for urgent assistance to help address its ballooning debt crisis. Now, this is important. They would pursue the IMF. But lastly, underneath a failed economy, the state sponsor of terrorism designation harms Sudan's economy. It harms Sudan's economy. But why is this? It scares off foreign investors, and they're not able to access the IMF. This brings me to my second point, a Russian presence. And again, this is a harm in the current system, and it is in the United States' interest to counter this harm. Doug Vando, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, a former special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and also a senior fellow in international religious persecution with the Institute on Religion and Public Policy, said, quote, "Moreover, Washington effectively opened Sudan for Russia. One Sudanese participant commented that Sudan cannot just stand still until sanctions are lifted. Sudan is left with no choice but to look east to Russia." End quote. Now this is important. Sudan is forced to look to Russia. They don't want to look to Russia, but they are forced to look to Russia because of their crippled economy, and they feel teased because the designation is still, to this point, not been removed, even though they've fulfilled all 5 regulations that the United States has set before them. Now this brings me to my next point underneath the Russian presence. Lost leverage. Now, leverage is possibly the most important thing in today's debate round. Whoever controls leverage over Sudan should earn your ballot. Now, when they go to Russia, we lose leverage over them. We lose leverage. And this is simply because Russia doesn't care if they sponsor human rights violations. Russia doesn't have the same moral responsibility that the United States has. This brings me to C for continued leverage. We can see that we have leverage through the IMF, the International Monetary Funds. My partner brought this up in her speech, and essentially the point is that if Sudan continues sponsoring terrorism or continues human rights violations, then they will be restricted from accessing the IMF, the International Monetary Funds. And this is important because it creates leverage over Sudan, something that the current system does not have. But why is this important? Because it helps accomplish U.S. interests, one of them being human rights abuses. By containing or maintaining leverage over Sudan, we will stop human rights abuses. Now this brings me to my last point. Terrorism thwarted. Now when we look back at a piece of evidence that we read earlier from the State Department, it says that Sudan has not only been not supporting terrorism, but they've been countering terrorism. By fixing the failed economy in Sudan, we are helping them achieve better ability to counter terrorism. Another one of the harms in the current system, and another one of the United States' interests. When we look at the interests, human rights violations, countering terrorism, and stopping the Russian presence in Sudan, we have fulfilled all of these with an affirmative ballot. because by fixing Sudan's economy, they will be better able to counter terrorism. By maintaining leverage over Sudan, we will stop human rights violations. And by maintaining leverage over Sudan, we will stop Russian involvement.